There are a lot of problems with the modern MCU. A truly big issue, I'm not gonna surprise most people here, is that there is just too much content now, and in order to understand movies that are being released, one also needs to be familiar with TV shows on Disney+. Maybe not all of them, but at least some of them. Before the Marvels, I felt obliged to watch Miss Marvel show, which was released last year. Last year I watched the first episode only and was not interested in the show, so I didn't watch beyond the first episode. But now I made myself see through all 6 episodes, and here's what I concluded after turning off my TV. The show is aggressively mediocre. There are problems with the way it is written and the way it is structured as well. Overload of content to what is just one big issue of the MCU. Another problem is that Marvel puts some big universal or even multiversal threats in almost every movie or show they release. In almost every movie or show, the price is the destruction of the world, and Miss Marvel is not an exception. What I enjoyed most in the show is the representation of Pakistani culture. It gave Miss Marvel a certain fascinating flavor that made it different compared to other MCU projects. I'm not from South Asia, so I won't testify how truthful the representation was, but at least it seems like it was respectfully done. Not just South Asian culture, but also religion. Miss Marvel portrays Muslims in a mosque in a pretty mundane way, showing that Muslims are just normal people, and it might be important for some people to finally feel validated, instead of being presented as terrorists or extremists. Just like in Kanto a couple of years ago, shed a light onto more positive aspects of Colombian culture, because most people, I'm sure, can only think of Pablo Escobar, Shakira and drug wars when it comes to Colombia, and not much of its culture or cuisine. But of course a lot of things were deliberately exaggerated, because the show targets mostly Pakistani Americans, Indian Americans, or white people who are not familiar with Asian cultures, rather than people who do live in South Asia. The one thing that put me off was constant mention of Bollywood, as if every person with South Asian heritage must be familiar with Bollywood movies and stars. But let's return to universal threats. Marvel managed to put a huge planetary threat even into Miss Marvel. The clandestines were easily the worst part of the show. Here I need to agree with most people. The clandestines are stuck on Earth. They want to return to their home world, but the only thing that can open a bridge between the worlds is the bangle, which Kamala inherits from her great-grandmother Aisha. Opening the bridge can quite literally destroy the Earth, so Kamala decides not to help because it's too risky. According to her friend Bruna, who is a teenage genius who can literally build any high technical device out of garbage in his room, and talks about pseudoscientific stuff that is supposed to make him look extremely smart. The clandestines have been waiting for decades since they lost Aisha, but couldn't wait a couple of days after they met Kamala. Kamala didn't even say no to them, but Najma, the leader of clandestines, just decided that Kamala betrayed them and violently attacked Kamala's brother's wedding. If clandestines weren't in the show, it could have given Miss Marvel more room to breathe as a coming-of-age story. As I said, I enjoy the cultural aspect and the relationship between Kamala and her parents, especially her strict conservative mother. The show could focus on Kamala learning how to control the powers she acquired and helping people, as well as trying to fit in both within her school and her family. In the first episode, other students and even teachers see Kamala as kinda weird, and her mom doesn't really support her obsession with superhero stuff. However, most problems with identity and weirdness vanish after the first episode, and in the second episode Kamala doesn't have any problems at school. If the show refocused its attention from the clandestines to Kamala's own struggles and problems, that could have been better. But a big chunk of the story was dedicated to half-baked villains in their plan. I don't know why, but most MCU directors and writers seem to be incapable of creating interesting and charismatic villains. Najma changes her heart pretty suddenly. She and other clandestines spent 8 decades on Earth, thinking of only going back home to Nur, but at the last moment Najma decides to sacrifice herself to save her son Kamran. Did she even have to sacrifice herself to close the bridge between the worlds? The show tried to portray Najma as a tragic and noble character who saves the world because of her love to her son. If you ask me, this didn't really work. Najma is a terribly written character. The show also touches on the partition of India, which happened in 1947, when British India was divided into 2 separate states, India and Pakistan. West Pakistan and East Pakistan, known today as Bangladesh, were created for Muslim people, so that Muslims and Hindus could avoid religious cleansing. Obviously, a lot of people suffered during the partition, and entire families had to flee their homes to survive. But this series is so focused on showing how bad the British for the day got partition part wrong. It wasn't the British idea to divide India into Hindu majority and Muslim majority parts, but the idea of religious leaders to split up the country to avoid violence between religious groups. And the British supported the decision and created two different countries. A lot of history was intentionally portrayed wrongly in this show. Another interesting plotline is women's struggle in mosques. Nakia, Kamala's friend, tired of gender discrimination, runs for a position in the mosque board. But the plotline takes only an episode and a half. It could be very interesting to show how Nakia tries to change the minds of religious elders and exposes sexism in religious communities. In the second episode, Nakia runs for a board member. The next episode, she wins the vote, and her struggle to change the community ends right here. We see nothing else. Maybe there would have been more of Nakia if the show didn't have the clandestines and didn't focus as much on the damage control. Damage Control is portrayed as this evil racist organization that raids a mosque for no reason. The show could portray discrimination against brown people in a lot of different ways, but they chose a pretty bad one. The show fails to explain why exactly Damage Control is particularly bad. They saw Kamala in the vicinity of the mosque and tried to capture her, but she managed to escape. Only after that the Damage Control came to examine the mosque, because they saw Kamala nearby and logically assumed that mosque might hide Kamala from the officials. They didn't just show up randomly because they hated Muslims. Most of the show suffers from poor writing, unfortunately. One more positive thing, Iman Vellani was a perfect casting choice. She made Kamala an adorable and nerdy main protagonist with a lot of internal struggles. My favorite episode out of 6 is episode 5, which shows us Aisha and how she started a family in an Indian village. The train scene was weird, however. Kamala, who went back in time because of her bangle, just casually creates magic and no one around her seems to care about it. Aisha gets stabbed and dies on a train station, and again, nobody seems to care about it. Overall, Ms. Marvel is my least favorite MCU show I've seen so far. It has a lot of cool montage and animation, but all this stuff mostly goes away after the first episode. Ms. Marvel is just a part of the big problem that the MCU faces right now. I honestly don't like the way the cinematic universe goes. If I were in charge of the MCU, I would have done Multiverse Saga differently. Let the movies have big universal threats, big spectacle is why people watch blockbuster movies in theaters after all. But let television be more experimental and risky. I would have made shows more disconnected from the movies, so that the general audience doesn't have to watch all the Disney Plus shows. I would have let showrunners make their projects different in style and tone. Ms. Marvel could have been a pretty nice slice of life coming of age story. Instead it just feels like a bloated 6-hour movie. This show should have less CGI because CGI in Ms. Marvel was pretty bad at the beginning and even outright laughable closer to the end. It's almost as bad as She-Hulk. Better only because the main protagonist is not a huge piece of walking bad CGI. All in all, the current strategy of Marvel is not working. Too much content, too formulaic, lack of innovations. Shows like WandaVision and Ms. Marvel started on a creative note but ended up being just typical Marvel spectacle. I can still tolerate MCU movies to a certain extent because watching a 2-hour blockbuster in a theater surrounded by other fans is still pretty fun. Watching 6 hours of dull content at home is a completely different story. I still haven't convinced myself to watch Hawkeye, Secret Invasion, or the second season of Loki. I am just not interested. Stories that are important to the MCU lore, like WandaVision or Loki, should have been movies instead. I'm sure a Loki movie would have been a huge theatrical success. The Marvels is predicted to flop at the box office, and I don't know whether the MCU will be able to recover its former popularity. It's pretty hard to guess right now, but it feels like MCU has a very grim future. New characters and their stories do not interest people as much as Captain America or Iron Man. And releasing mediocre content doesn't help, that's for certain. As usual, I am Equestria Guy. See you again.